Alright, let's talk about Henry James, one of the central figures of 19th century realism, and yes, that's been asked in exam more than once. Henry James was born in New York in 1843 into a wealthy and intellectual family. His father, Henry James Sr., was a respected clergyman and thinker, and his siblings, including the famous philosopher William James, were also brilliant. So, you could say intellect practically ran in the family. From early on, Henry James was shaped by travel. He moved back and forth between America and Europe, and that constant cultural exchange became the very foundation of his writing. His works often explore the contrast between American innocence and European sophistication, especially among upper-class society, another point often asked in exam. He studied across Europe in Geneva, London, Paris, Bologna, and Bonn, and even briefly attended Harvard Law School before realizing the courtroom wasn't for him. Literature was his true calling. James was astonishingly productive. 22 novels, over 100 short stories, and several plays. But critics usually divide his career into three distinct phases, a question that's also come up in exam. In his first phase, James wrote with a clear, simple style, direct storytelling focused on young Americans discovering Europe. His early novella, Daisy Miller from 1879, is the perfect example. It tells the story of a young American girl who struggles to fit into rigid European high society. Daisy Miller is still one of his most widely read works, and yes, it's frequently asked in exam. Then comes The Portrait of a Lady, published in 1881, which remains his masterpiece from this middle period. It's the story of Isabel Archer, an independent young American woman whose ideals clash with European corruption and manipulation. The themes of freedom, self-discovery, and disillusionment make it one of the defining novels of realism. In his second phase, James turned to drama and short fiction, experimenting with dialogue and stagecraft to sharpen his sense of psychological tension. By his third phase, his prose became far more complex, long sentences, interior monologues, and intricate psychological detail. This is where we get his mature works like The Wings of the Dove 1902, The Ambassadors 1903, and The Golden Bowl 1904. Among these, The Ambassadors is often considered his finest achievement, and that's been asked directly in exam. Some of his other important works include The Bostonians 1886, which explores early feminism, and What Maisie Knew 1897, which tells the story of a young girl caught between divorced parents. And then, of course, there's The Turn of the Screw, a chilling ghost story novella that's still studied for its ambiguity and psychological depth. All of these titles have appeared in exam questions. James's works were later adapted for film, The Wings of the Dove, Washington Square, and The Portrait of a Lady among them, proving just how cinematic his character studies were. What made Henry James truly special was his psychological realism. Instead of focusing on grand plots, he explored the inner life thoughts, emotions, perceptions, and moral struggles. His style can feel dense, but it's deeply rewarding because every sentence unfolds like a portrait of the human mind. He died in 1916 from pneumonia after suffering a stroke, but by then he had left behind one of the richest legacies in English prose. So, to summarize for exam prep, Henry James, major figure of 19th century realism. His key theme, the meeting of American innocence and European sophistication. Daisy Miller, The Portrait of a Lady, The Ambassadors, and The Turn of the Screw, all crucial works to remember. And his prose detailed, psychological, elegant, and deeply human. Henry James once said that it is art that makes life, makes interest, makes importance. And through his art, he gave realism its most refined psychological voice. Alright, let's talk about one of the true masters of psychological realism, Henry James. His fiction sits right at the crossroads of 19th century realism and modernism, blending European refinement with American freshness. Now, before we dive into his novels, remember this. James spent most of his life moving between America and Europe. and that transatlantic tension between innocence and experience, freedom and convention defines nearly all of his works. Let's start with his novels. His early works include Watch and Ward 1871 and Roderick Hudson 1875, but it was the American 1877 that first brought him real recognition, and yes, that title has been asked in exam. Then came The Europeans and Confidence, followed by one of his most famous novels, Washington Square in 1880, a beautifully quiet story of love, pride, and disappointment. But his real masterpiece from this early period is The Portrait of a Lady 1881, and this one, my friends, comes up in exam all the time. The novel follows Isabel Archer, a spirited young American who unexpectedly inherits wealth and travels to Europe seeking freedom and self-discovery. There, she marries Gilbert Osmond, only to discover his manipulative nature and cruel motives. Isabel's struggle between personal freedom and moral duty forms the emotional core of the story, and those points about her inheritance, her marriage, and Osmond's deceit are all popular exam questions. As his career evolved, James began experimenting with structure and psychology. He published The Bostonians and The Princess Casamassima in the 1880s, followed by The Tragic Muse, The Spoils of Poynton, and What Maisie Knew, that last one's another exam favorite, exploring a child's view of adult hypocrisy. Then come his great late novels, often called the major phase. These include The Wings of the Dove, 1902, The Ambassadors, 1903, and The Golden Bowl, 1904. All three examine complex relationships, moral choices, and the subtle manipulations of upper-class life, and each has been asked in exam. He also wrote two unfinished novels, The Ivory Tower and The Sense of the Past, both published posthumously in 1917. Yes, that's another one you'll want to mark for exam. Now, apart from his novels, James was a prolific short story writer. His first story, A Tragedy of Error, came out in 1864, followed by The Story of a Year, which is also an exam point. One of his most famous shorter works is Daisy Miller, 1878, a novella published in the Cornhill magazine. Both details have been tested. It tells the story of a young American girl, Daisy Miller, who travels through Europe, charming everyone with her openness. But her free-spirited nature clashes with European social conventions. She is judged harshly, gossiped about, and ultimately dies of malaria, her death symbolizing innocence misunderstood by a rigid society. And then comes The Turn of the Screw, 1898, one of the most haunting ghost stories ever written, and yes, a favorite in exam. The story follows a governess who cares for two children, Miles and Flora, at a remote country house. She begins to see the ghosts of the former servants, Peter Quint and Miss Jessel, and believes the children are under their evil influence. The tension grows as Miles's strange behavior and Flora's fear intensify. But here's the twist. We're never sure if the ghosts are real or just the governess's imagination. That ambiguity, the question of her sanity, is central to the story's brilliance and a frequent exam question. James also wrote for the stage, though less successfully. His plays include Pyramus and Thisbe, Still Waters, A Change of Heart that once been asked in exam, Daisy Miller adapted in 1882, and The American adapted in 1890. But Henry James wasn't just a novelist, he was a major critic and essayist. His key critical works include French Poets and Novelists 1878, Picture and Text 1893, Notes on Novelists 1914, and The Art of the Novel, Critical Prefaces, published posthumously in 1934. All of these have been tested in exam. These essays define his famous idea of the central consciousness, the notion that the story should be filtered through a single observing mind. In short, Henry James gave English fiction its psychological depth. From the portrait of a lady to the ambassadors, from Daisy Miller to the turn of the screw, he turned the novel into a study of perception, morality, and consciousness. Or as critics often say while other writers told stories, Henry James taught readers how to look at life.